Her dog wouldn't stop staring at a dead phone, and it exposed a truth buried for 26 years. At 67, with $61 and nowhere to go, Marisol Vega stepped off a bus and walked back to the only place still tied to her name, a burned-out gas station everyone else had forgotten. The windows were boarded, the pumps stripped, the past sealed behind cracked walls. But inside that ruined office, her German Shepherd froze beneath an old rotary phone, as if he could hear something she couldn't. Have you ever ignored a small sign that later turned out to mean everything? Tell me what happened. The bus arrived without ceremony. It groaned to a stop beside a cracked stretch of pavement where weeds pushed through the seams like stubborn survivors. The sign above the bench read, "Redwater Flats, transit stop." But though the paint had peeled so badly, it looked more like a warning than a welcome. Marisol Vega rose slowly from her seat. 26 years inside had trained her body to move with caution. No sudden gestures, no unnecessary attention. At 67, she felt every mile the bus had traveled in her knees. She reached for the duffel bag tucked beneath her seat. It was light. One change of clothes, a toothbrush, a folded discharge packet, $61 in cash tucked into the lining. The bus driver didn't look at her when he opened the door. She stepped down onto the pavement. The doors folded shut behind her with a hiss, and the bus pulled away, leaving a curl of exhaust that drifted across the empty road before dissolving into the afternoon heat. For a long moment, she stood there alone. Most Redwater Flats hadn't grown. It had rusted. The industrial outskirts stretched wide and quiet. Corrugated warehouses sagged behind chain-link fences. An old tire yard sat abandoned across the street, its metal sign hanging crooked on one bolt. Beyond it, smokestacks rose like broken fingers against a pale sky. No one had come. She hadn't expected anyone to. Her mother was gone. Her sister had moved north decades ago and stopped writing. The few friends who once visited the station had vanished into marriages, jobs, or silence after the trial. Marisol adjusted the strap on her duffel bag and began walking. She knew the road by memory, though it had been half her lifetime since she'd last walked it freely. Back then, she'd been 41, angry and grieving. Back then, there had been police lights flashing against metal siding. There's neighbors watching from behind curtains. Back then, she still believed someone would fix the mistake. The asphalt shimmered ahead of her. Each step echoed faintly in the emptiness. A freight train rolled somewhere in the distance, its horn low and lonely. The station stood at the far edge of town, where the highway bent away toward the desert. Vega Fuel and Service. Daniel's pride. Her husband's life's work. The jury had called it an insurance scheme. The fire report had called it faulty wiring. The court had called it arson. She called it the night everything ended. By the time the station came into view, the sun had dipped just low enough to cast long shadows across the lot. It looked smaller than she remembered. The sign bearing the Vega name had fallen sideways, its letters half-burned and sun-bleached. The gas pumps were skeletal, hoses gone, panels ripped open, metal rusted through like brittle lace. The windows were boarded with warped plywood tagged in spray paint. The asphalt lot had split wide enough for weeds to grow tall and dry. Marisol stopped at the edge of the property. This was still hers. Technically, no bank had bothered to seize it. No buyer had stepped forward. It had simply been left to decay, like something inconvenient no one wanted to touch. She stepped onto the lot, gravel crunching beneath her worn sneakers. The air carried the faint smell of dust and old oil baked into concrete. That was when she saw him. At first, she thought it was a shadow. Then the shadow shifted. A German Shepherd stood near the corner of the building, tethered loosely to a fence post by a frayed length of rope. His coat was thick but dull with neglect, black and tan fading into the grime of the lot. His ribs showed faintly beneath his fur. His ears were upright, alert, watching her. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood there, amber eyes steady and unblinking. Marisol slowed her steps. "Hey there," she said quietly, her voice rough from disuse. The dog's head tilted slightly, but he didn't retreat. No food bowl. No water. The rope was long enough for him to reach the side of the building, but not much farther. Someone had left him here. Maybe days ago. Maybe longer. Abandoned, same as the station, same as her. She approached carefully, palms open at her sides. The dog's tail gave a single cautious thump against the dirt. Not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes. Not wild, not feral, waiting. She crouched slowly, joints protesting. "Guess we're both out of options," she murmured. The dog stepped forward and sniffed the air around her hand. His nose brushed her knuckles, warm and damp. He smelled faintly of sun-warmed fur and dry grass. He did not pull away. Marisol looked at the station again. The broken windows, the locked service bay door hanging crooked on one hinge, the faded Vega name barely visible through soot and time. No electricity, no water, no plan. But it was shelter. She rose, walked to the service bay, and tested the door. It resisted at first, then scraped open with a metallic groan that echoed into the hollow interior. Dust motes floated in the dim light. She turned back toward the dog. "You staying?" she asked softly. He held her gaze. The rope creaked gently in the breeze. Marisol stepped closer to the fence post and examined the knot. It wasn't tight. Whoever had tied it hadn't meant for it to hold long. She hesitated only a second before loosening it. The rope fell away. The shepherd didn't run. He walked past her slowly and entered the shadowed service bay without looking back. Marisol stood in the fading light, her duffel bag heavy against her shoulder, the empty lot stretching silent behind her. The bus was long gone. The town hadn't noticed her return. But inside the broken shell of Vega fuel and service, the dog waited. And for the first time since the bus doors closed behind her, Marisol didn't feel entirely alone. The service bay smelled of old grease and rain-soaked metal. Marisol stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. The concrete floor was layered in dust and scattered debris, rusted bolts, broken glass, a collapsed folding chair near the far wall. The air was still, heavy with years of abandonment. The German shepherd moved ahead of her, paws silent on the floor, tail low but steady. He didn't explore wildly like a stray who'd just been freed. He walked with purpose, circling once near the back office doorway before stopping beneath something mounted on the wall. Marisol followed his gaze. The old rotary phone hung exactly where it had been decades ago, avocado green faded to a chalky gray. The coiled cord dangled loosely. Dust coated the receiver so thickly it softened its edges. Yet the wire that once connected it to the outside world had been cut clean and left exposed, the copper long since oxidized. The dog sat directly beneath it. He looked up at the phone, then back at her. Marisol exhaled slowly. "There's nothing there," she murmured. She set her duffel bag down near the office doorway and walked toward him. The phone hadn't rung in over 26 years. It hadn't rung the night the fire swallowed the back storage room. It hadn't rung when the police cuffed her in front of neighbors. It hadn't rung once during the trial when she kept waiting for someone, anyone, to call in a correction, a confession, a miracle. It was dead. She reached down and gently tugged at the dog's collarless neck. "Come on, let's see what's left of the place." He didn't snap. He didn't resist violently. But a low sound vibrated from his chest, not directed at her, but toward the wall behind the phone. Not a growl of aggression, a warning. Marisol stilled. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight. She released her hand and stepped back. The shepherd remained seated, eyes locked upward, ears rigid. "All right," she said quietly. "Have it your way." The light outside faded toward evening. Through a gap in the boards, she could see the sky turning pale orange, the industrial skyline cutting sharp lines against it. She scanned the interior for something usable, a blanket, a tarp, anything to keep the cold off concrete. Behind the service bay, the small office still held the metal desk Daniel had bought used from a mechanic who retired. The drawers hung open. Papers were scattered across the floor like dried leaves, but most were illegible now, ink faded or water damaged. She found a torn vinyl bench cushion and dragged it toward the corner of the office. It would serve as padding for the night. When she returned to the main bay, the shepherd hadn't moved, still beneath the phone. "You guarding it?" she asked softly. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice. She walked to the doorway and looked outside. The lot was empty. No headlights, no footsteps, just wind sliding across gravel. Back inside, she leaned a shoulder against the wall opposite the phone and studied it. The mounting plate was slightly crooked. She didn't remember it sitting that way. Then again, memory blurred after so many years. "You must have been someone's house dog," she said to the shepherd. "Too polite to be wild?" He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the wall. The air grew cooler as darkness settled. Marisol shut the service bay door halfway, leaving a narrow gap for air. She rummaged through her bag and found the thin, state-issued sweatshirt she'd been given upon release. It wasn't warm, but it was something. When she returned to the office corner to arrange the cushion, she heard a soft shuffle behind her. The shepherd had moved, but not far. He had repositioned himself directly under the phone again, lowering his body to the floor, chin resting on his paws, eyes still lifted toward it. Marisol walked over once more, this time crouching slowly beside him. She followed his line of sight. The phone. The blank plaster wall behind it. Nothing else. She reached up and lifted the receiver. Dust fell in a faint cloud. She held it to her ear. Oh, silence. Not even static. She replaced it carefully. "You hear something I don't?" she whispered. The shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor. Then he rose and pressed his shoulder lightly against her leg, not pushing her away, just anchoring himself to her. She rested her hand against his thick fur. It was warmer than the room, steady and alive. Outside, a distant truck rumbled down the highway. The sound passed and faded. Inside the service bay, only their breathing remained. Marisol returned to the office corner and lowered herself onto the cushion. The concrete leached heat from her bones. She folded her arms across her chest and stared at the cracked ceiling. 26 years of institutional noise, metal doors, shouted counts, fluorescent hum, had trained her to sleep lightly. Here, the silence felt heavier than prison ever had. After a few minutes, she heard claws scrape softly against concrete. The shepherd padded into the office and circled once near her makeshift bed. Then, instead of lying beside her, he walked back into the main bay. She turned her head. He had returned to the phone. He lay down beneath it again, body angled slightly toward the doorway, as if standing watch. Marisol let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Suit yourself, Ranger," she murmured. The name felt right. Ranger. Alert. Guarded. Loyal to something invisible. Her eyelids grew heavy as the last light drained from the sky. The scent of oil and dust settled into her lungs. The floor was hard, but exhaustion carried its own mercy. Just before sleep pulled her under, she opened her eyes one more time and looked toward the service bay. The shepherd's silhouette was visible in the faint moonlight slipping through the boards, still beneath the old rotary phone, still watching. And though she didn't understand why, the sight of him there steadied her in a way nothing else had since she stepped off that bus. Morning came pale and thin over Redwater Flats. Marisol woke before the sun cleared the warehouses, her back stiff and her fingers numb from the cold floor. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell of oil and dust returned, and with it the faint outline of the office walls. She pushed herself upright. Ranger was already awake. He stood in the doorway between the office and the service bay, ears forward, alert to something beyond the boarded windows. When she rose, he glanced at her but did not leave his post. Outside, a delivery truck roared past on the highway. The vibration rattled the loose metal paneling along the bay wall. Ranger's muscles tightened, then relaxed when the sound faded. "You take your job seriously," she said quietly. She stepped into the main bay. The rotary phone hung where it had last night, silent, lifeless. Ranger walked beneath it once, sniffed at the wall, then followed her outside. The morning light revealed more damage than she'd seen in the dusk. The roof sagged near the rear corner. The gas pumps were stripped clean. Someone had spray-painted arsonist across one of the boarded windows in faded red letters. Marisol stood still for a long time, reading it. 26 years, and the word still followed her. Now she picked up a broken brick from the gravel and scraped at the paint. It didn't budge. Ranger circled the lot, nose low, tail steady. He paused near the old service sign and looked toward the road, as if expecting something. Marisol slung her duffel bag over her shoulder. "Come on," she said. "Let's see what's left of town." Redwater Flats hadn't grown kinder with time. The diner on Main Street still had the same faded red awning. The hardware store across from it displayed chainsaws and fertilizer bags in the window. A new pharmacy sign blinked beside a payday loan storefront. As she walked, conversations thinned. A man exiting the diner stopped mid-step when he saw her. A woman holding a grocery bag stared openly before turning away. No one greeted her. No one asked how she'd been. And a teenager leaned against a pickup and whispered to his friend. The word prison floated faintly in the air. Ranger stayed close to her left side, not crowding her, but present. When someone stepped too near, his ears lifted and his posture changed, not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. Marisol kept her gaze forward. She stopped at the small employment office near the railroad tracks. The woman behind the counter scanned her ID, glanced at the date of release, then at her face. "Any recent work history?" the woman asked without looking up. "Laundry detail, kitchen prep, maintenance crew." "In here?" Marisol shook her head. The woman's lips pressed thin. "We'll call if something opens up." They wouldn't. Outside, Ranger sniffed at a metal bench. Marisol rested her hands on her hips and studied the skyline. Smoke drifted from a plant near the river. She noticed a new billboard rising above the highway bend. Harlan Infrastructure Building, the future of Redwater. The image showed a sleek overpass cutting through open land. She followed the direction of the arrow printed at the bottom of the sign. The arrow pointed toward the industrial edge of town, toward her station. Her stomach tightened. Back at the property, a white SUV sat parked near the lot entrance. Two men in reflective vests stood near the broken pumps, clipboards in hand. Marisol slowed her steps. Ranger stiffened. One of the men glanced up. His eyes traveled from her worn sweatshirt to the dog, then to the sagging building behind them. "Property owner?" he asked. "Yes." He exchanged a look with his partner. We're conducting preliminary assessments for a proposed bypass expansion. This parcel is under review." "Under review for what?" "Acquisition." He spoke the word casually, as if discussing weather. She felt the weight of it settle. "I didn't agree to sell." He shrugged. "Nothing official yet. Harlan Infrastructure is evaluating options. This stretch would be ideal for access ramp development." The name struck like a physical tap to her chest. Gordon Harlan, the man who'd sat in a pressed suit during her trial and testified about insurance discrepancies. The man who'd said Daniel had been struggling financially. The man who'd implied motive. She folded her arms. "There's no deal." The man jotted something down and nodded. "Just surveying." They left soon after, tires crunching over gravel. Marisol stood in the middle of the lot long after the SUV disappeared. Ranger walked slowly back into the service bay. By dusk, she had cleared a small patch of debris near the entrance. She dragged broken boards aside and stacked scrap metal into a corner. Sweat dampened her collar despite the cooling air. Inside, Ranger resumed his strange routine. He returned to the old rotary phone. This time, he didn't sit quietly. He scratched at the wall behind it. Once. Twice. Then he stopped, head tilted, listening. Marisol wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. He scratched again, short, deliberate strokes at the plaster just beneath the phone mount. The sound echoed sharply in the empty bay. She pressed her ear to the wall. Nothing. No hum. No vibration. And only her own breath and the faint wind slipping through cracks in the boards. Ranger paced once in a tight circle and returned to the same spot. His nails scraped insistently. "Enough," she said gently. But when she stepped away, he moved back beneath the phone and lay down, chin resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the wall as if something inside it might answer. Night fell faster than she expected. The industrial skyline flickered with distant factory lights. A train horn sounded again, long and low. Marisol sat against the far wall, knees drawn up, watching the dog's silhouette beneath the phone. The town had made its position clear. The land wasn't forgotten. It was wanted. And the man whose company now hovered over it was the same man who had helped bury her 26 years ago. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears rigid, but he rose and pressed his nose to the wall again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was sharper this time, more urgent. Marisol's pulse ticked upward. "You're hearing something," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He stared at the wall like it held a secret. And for the first time since stepping off the bus, Marisol felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but tension. As if the past wasn't done with her after all. The service bay felt smaller that night. The air carried a faint chill, and every small sound seemed amplified. The scrape of Ranger's claws, the shifting of loose metal siding, the distant hum of traffic bleeding through boarded windows. Marisol sat upright against the office wall, eyes fixed on the silhouette beneath the rotary phone. Scratch! 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 As a Ranger's nails dragged across plaster in short, deliberate strokes. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't pacing. He was focused. "Ranger," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. Instead, he stood and barked once, sharp, sudden, startling in the hollow space. The sound echoed off the concrete floor and ricocheted around the empty station. It was the first time he had barked since she freed him. Marisol pushed herself to her feet. "All right," she said under her breath. "All right." She walked toward the wall slowly, half expecting to hear something now that he'd drawn attention to it. She pressed her ear against the plaster again. Nothing. No ringing, no static, no vibration. Only the faint thud of her own heartbeat. Ranger stepped aside just enough to let her stand directly beneath the phone. His body trembled, not from fear, but from alertness. His ears twitched as if tracking a frequency she couldn't detect. She reached up and lifted the receiver once more. Silence. The cord hung limp. The cut line near the base of the wall was clearly visible. Dead. She replaced the receiver carefully and studied the wall. The paint around the mount was slightly darker than the surrounding plaster. A faint square outline, almost invisible, framed the phone base. Her brow furrowed. "That wasn't there," she murmured. Or maybe it had been. 26 years was long enough to forget details. Ranger barked again, shorter this time, and struck the wall once more with his paw. The sound echoed differently now. Hollow. Marisol froze. She stepped back and rapped her knuckles against the plaster where he'd been scratching. Solid. And then she moved 2 inches to the left and knocked again. A dull, empty thud answered. Her stomach tightened. She knocked again. Hollow. Ranger's tail flicked once. She scanned the floor for something heavy. Near the tool rack, she spotted a rusted tire iron half buried under debris. She dragged it free, wiped off the dust with her sleeve, and returned to the wall. "Let's see what you're hearing," she whispered. She struck the plaster lightly. A crack spidered across the surface. Dust drifted downward. She paused, listening. Nothing changed. She hit it again, harder. The plaster gave way with a brittle snap, a small chunk falling to the concrete at her feet. Ranger jumped back, then immediately stepped forward again, nose pushing toward the broken section. Marisol crouched and brushed loose debris aside. All behind the plaster was not insulation. It was a thin sheet of metal, square, deliberate. Her breath caught. She widened the opening carefully, breaking away more of the brittle wall until the metal panel was fully visible. It was roughly the size of a notebook, secured with 4 small screws. The screws were newer than the surrounding structure, less corroded. "Daniel," she whispered. Her hands trembled. Ranger pressed his nose against the edge of the metal, tail swaying once in tight anticipation. She used the tire iron to pry at one corner. The screw resisted at first, then loosened with a metallic squeal. One by one, she removed them, setting each carefully on the floor beside her. When the final screw came free, The panel shifted outward. Marisol eased it open. Much behind it sat a small rectangular device mounted to the inner studs. Dust covered its surface, but its shape was unmistakable. A recorder. Old. Analog. Wires running from its side into the back of the rotary phone's internal housing. Her heart pounded so loudly, she almost didn't notice Ranger's low whine beside her. "Is this what you've been hearing?" she breathed. The device was larger than a modern handheld recorder, closer to the size of a thick, hardcover book. A small red indicator light blinked faintly on its corner. Blink, pause, blink. Her throat went dry. It had power. She stared at the thin wire bundle connecting the recorder to the phone's base. The wiring wasn't random. It had been carefully threaded and secured. Hidden. Intentional. Ranger sat back on his haunches, watching her face now instead of the wall. You didn't hear ghosts," she murmured. "You heard this." A faint mechanical hum rose from the device, so subtle she hadn't registered it before. It was almost beyond human hearing, but not beyond a shepherd's. Marisol reached out slowly and touched the casing. It vibrated faintly beneath her fingertips. She swallowed hard. Daniel had always been careful, quiet, methodical. He fixed engines by listening before he touched them. Had he built this? Why? Her mind raced back to the weeks before the fire. The long phone calls behind closed office doors. The tension in Daniel's shoulders. The way he'd started locking the front door even during business hours. She had asked him what was wrong. He had said, "Nothing we can't handle." Her fingers brushed against a small compartment door on the side of the recorder, and it clicked open under light pressure. Inside was a slot holding a thin cassette-style archive unit and an older battery pack wired directly into the housing. Ranger leaned closer, ears forward. Marisol lifted the cassette unit gently. It was labeled in black marker. April 14th. Her breath left her lungs in a slow, shaking exhale. The fire had happened on April 15th. She stared at the date for a long time. The building felt impossibly quiet around her. Even the highway noise seemed distant now. Ranger nudged her arm gently. "Okay," she whispered. Her hand hovered over the small playback button on the device. For a moment, fear stopped her. What if it was nothing? What if it changed nothing? What if it changed everything? Ranger's steady presence at her side grounded her. She pressed play. The tape whirred softly to life. A static filled the air first, grainy and thin. Then a voice, familiar, low, steady. "Daniel Vega, recording for my own records." Marisol's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She gripped the edge of the broken wall to stay upright. Ranger sat motionless beside her as the voice from 26 years ago continued to fill the hollow service bay. And just like that, the silence that had surrounded the station for decades was broken. "If anyone ever hears this," Daniel's voice said through a thin layer of static, "it means things didn't go the way I hoped." Marisol's fingers tightened around the edge of the recorder. His tone was steady, calmer than she remembered from those final weeks. There was no panic in it, no confusion, only intention. "I've been approached again," the voice continued. "Gordon Harlan, third time this month. He wants the property. Says it's strategic for a bypass plan he's working on. I told him no." The tape crackled softly. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move. Marisol lowered herself slowly onto the concrete floor beneath the broken wall, never taking her eyes off the recorder. "I don't trust him," Daniel's voice said. "He keeps mentioning insurance audits, keeps asking about our financials like he's already seen them. Tonight he said something that didn't sit right. He said, 'Sometimes properties change hands when people can't manage their risks.'" The words seemed to echo in the cold space. Marisol remembered that night. Daniel had come home late. He hadn't eaten dinner. He'd stared at the television without watching it. "I've backed up our insurance correspondence," the recording continued. "And I'm documenting everything from now on. If this place burns, it won't be an accident." Her breath hitched. She pressed her palm over her mouth. The fire report had concluded faulty wiring near the rear supply shelves. Electrical degradation. Insurance dispute. Case closed. But this was something else. The tape clicked softly as it advanced. "I don't know how far he's willing to go," Daniel said, "but I won't sell. This land belonged to my father before me. If something happens, I want it known that I refused." The recording ended with a soft mechanical whir. Silence rushed back in. Marisol sat frozen, the weight of 26 years pressing in from all sides. The jury had said she set the fire to collect insurance money. The prosecution had painted Daniel as drowning in debt. Harlan's testimony had focused on financial irregularities, small gaps in accounting that became motive under cross-examination. She had screamed in that courtroom, not out loud, inside. "Play it again," she whispered. She pressed rewind. The tape spun backward with a faint hiss. Ranger leaned closer as if guarding the device. The recording played again. This time she caught subtler details. The way Daniel cleared his throat before saying Harlan's name. The hesitation before, "If this place burns," it wasn't fear. It was preparation. Her eyes drifted to the open wall panel. The recorder had been hidden deliberately, wired into the phone housing, powered independently. Daniel had known something was coming, and he hadn't told her. Or maybe he had tried, and she hadn't listened hard enough. When she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, unaware until that moment that she'd been crying. Outside, a truck roared past on the highway, rattling the loose boards over the windows. The present rushed in for a second, then faded again. Marisol carefully removed the cassette and searched the compartment for others. There were more. 3 labeled with different dates in the weeks leading up to April 15th. She stared at them like fragile artifacts. Ranger stood and turned toward the service bay door as headlights swept briefly across the lot. He moved instinctively between her and the opening. The lights passed. The tension in his posture eased. She slid another tape into place. The second recording began mid-conversation. "You're underestimating the timeline," Daniel said. Another voice responded, clearer than she expected. "Mush Gordon Harlan." "You're underestimating opportunity," Harlan said coolly. "The county board is already leaning our direction. You hold out much longer, you risk losing leverage." "I'm not selling." "You don't need to sell," Harlan replied. "Circumstances change." There was a faint clink of glass in the background, a chair shifting. "You threatening me?" Daniel asked. A pause. "Not at all," Harlan said smoothly. "Just advising you to think long-term." The tape cut abruptly. Marisol felt the air leave her lungs. That voice, that polished, unhurried voice. She had heard it testify under oath. He had looked composed then too, sympathetic even. "I warned Daniel about potential liabilities," he had told the jury. Liabilities. The word now sounded like a blade wrapped in velvet, while Marisol leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling beams above her. 26 years, 26 birthdays behind bars, 26 winters under fluorescent lights. And this had been sitting inside her own office wall the entire time. Ranger returned to her side and rested his head lightly against her knee. She ran her fingers slowly through his fur. "You heard it," she murmured. "You heard what I couldn't." The dog's breathing was steady and warm. She played the final labeled tape. This one was shorter. Daniel's voice sounded strained. "Insurance audit scheduled tomorrow," he said. "Harlan's firm pushed it through fast. Feels coordinated." A pause. "If something happens tonight..." The tape stopped. Abrupt, as if interrupted. Marisol closed her eyes. That night, she remembered the smoke first, then the sirens, then the shouting. She remembered being held back by neighbors while flames consumed the rear storage shelves. She remembered someone pulling her away as firefighters rushed past. She remembered Daniel going back inside. She never saw him come out. The court had said faulty wiring sparked near the old breaker box. The prosecution had said she tampered with it. The tape in her hands said something entirely different. Ranger shifted again, glancing toward the broken wall. The red indicator light on the recorder still blinked faintly. Blink, pause, blink, alive. Marisol took a slow breath. The fear she'd felt in prison, the helplessness, the exhaustion, began to shift into something else. Not hope, not yet, but clarity. She stood carefully and closed the metal panel halfway, leaving the device accessible but protected from dust. She didn't screw it shut. Not this time. The evidence wasn't going back into hiding. She walked to the doorway and looked out over the darkened lot. The billboard near the highway loomed in the distance. Harlan Infrastructure Building, the future of Redwater. Her jaw tightened. Ranger stepped beside her, gaze following hers toward the road. "He thought I was gone," she said quietly. The night wind moved across the gravel, lifting faint dust. Inside the broken station, Daniel's voice lingered in her memory like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. Marisol turned back toward the exposed wall and the old rotary phone hanging crooked above it. For 26 years, she had believed the fire was the end of the story. Now it felt like the beginning of something else. And this time, she wasn't standing alone. Morning broke sharper than usual, the sunlight cutting clean lines through the cracks in the boarded windows. Marisol hadn't slept much. The tapes had replayed in her mind over and over, Daniel's steady voice echoing in the hollow space of the station. Ranger lay beside her near the exposed wall, head lifted at the slightest sound. Every passing vehicle on the highway made his ears twitch. Marisol rose stiffly and walked back to the recorder. The red light still blinked, faint but steady. Proof. Solid, mechanical proof that something had been hidden. Something that contradicted everything the court had decided. She removed the cassette carefully and slipped it into her duffel bag. "If I'm going to do this," she murmured, "I need someone who knows how." The name came to her from a newspaper clipping she had read years ago in the prison library. Elena Morales, civil rights attorney, wrongful conviction cases. She remembered the article because it had felt like fiction at the time. Cases overturned, people walking free after decades. She had never imagined needing someone like that outside a cell. The public library in Redwater Flats was smaller than she remembered. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she approached the front desk. A few heads turned when she entered. Ranger walked at her side, calm but watchful. A woman behind the counter glanced at the dog. "He's allowed?" she asked cautiously. "He won't cause trouble," Marisol said evenly. The woman hesitated, then nodded toward the computer terminals. "Keep him close." Marisol sat down and typed the name slowly into the search bar. Elena Morales, and Hart Civil Rights Litigation. Phone number, email, office located 2 counties over. Her hand hovered above the mouse. 26 years had taught her that asking for help often led nowhere, but she dialed anyway. The call rang twice before a receptionist answered. Marisol kept her explanation short. Wrongful conviction. New evidence. Recorded threats tied to land acquisition. There was a pause on the other end. "Can you send the recordings?" the receptionist asked. "Yes. Ms. Morales will review them personally." Marisol ended the call and sat back, heart pounding harder than it had in the courtroom decades earlier. Back at the station, she found a working outlet in the rear office that still connected to an exterior power line. She charged an old phone left behind in a drawer, then carefully recorded the cassette playback into a digital file. Ranger watched her the entire time. Every knock of loose wiring, every creak in the boards, he reacted before she did. By mid-afternoon, she had sent the files. The waiting began. It didn't take long for Harlan Infrastructure to make its own move. A city inspection truck rolled onto the lot just before sunset. Ranger was on his feet before the engine cut off. 2 uniformed code enforcement officers stepped out, holding clipboards. "Marisol Vega?" one called. "Yes. We've received complaints regarding unsafe occupancy and structural violations. This property is uninhabitable." "I'm aware of its condition. We'll need to post a notice. You can't stay here overnight." Ranger stepped closer to her side, body rigid but silent. "This is my property," she said calmly. The officer avoided her gaze. "Regulations are regulations." They stapled a bright orange notice to the warped plywood covering the front window. "Unsafe structure. No occupancy permitted." As the truck pulled away, Marisol stared at the paper flapping in the wind. Pressure. It had started. She felt Ranger's shoulder press gently against her leg. "I expected this," she whispered. The phone in her hand buzzed. An unfamiliar number. she answered cautiously. Ms. Vega? The voice was firm, composed. This is Elena Morales? Marisol's grip tightened. I've reviewed your recordings, Elena continued. Oh, they're significant. Very significant. Marisol exhaled slowly. The voice clearly identifies Gordon Harlan making coercive statements tied to property acquisition. Combined with the timing of the insurance audit and the fire, there's reason to examine whether evidence was manipulated. Silence settled between them for a moment. I believe your conviction deserves a formal review, Elena said. The words landed heavier than any verdict. I'll need access to the original trial transcripts, insurance documents, and the physical recorder if possible. You can have all of it, Marisol replied. Be aware, Elena continued. Once this moves forward, there will be resistance. Marisol glanced at the orange notice fluttering on the window. It's already started. That evening, unfamiliar vehicles passed more frequently on the highway. But Ranger tracked each one, positioning himself near the lot entrance. Marisol cleared more debris from the office and secured the exposed panel loosely, leaving it accessible. The tension that had once paralyzed her began to shift into motion. Not frantic, focused. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind. If something happens tonight, something had happened. And now someone was finally listening. The following morning, another SUV slowed near the entrance. This one bore the Harlan Infrastructure logo on its door. Ranger stepped forward immediately, placing himself squarely between Marisol and the vehicle. The engine idled for a moment, before moving on. No one stepped out. Not yet. Inside the station, the old rotary phone hung above the partially broken wall, silent and unchanged. But the silence no longer felt empty, and it felt like a line had been drawn. And this time, Marisol was ready to cross it. The morning air carried the dry scent of dust and diesel when the black sedan rolled onto the lot. It wasn't marked like the survey trucks. It didn't idle uncertainly at the entrance. It drove in with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he already owned the ground beneath his tires. Ranger was on his feet before the engine cut. His body didn't tense in confusion this time. It locked in recognition. Marisol stepped out from the service bay, wiping her hands on a rag she'd found in an old drawer. The orange unsafe structure notice still flapped against the plywood near the entrance. The driver's door opened slowly. Gordon Harlan stepped out in a tailored gray suit that didn't belong anywhere near rusted gas pumps and cracked asphalt. While his hair was thinner now than it had been in the courtroom decades ago, but his posture was unchanged, upright, measured, composed. He adjusted his cufflinks as if preparing for a board meeting, rather than a confrontation. Miss Vega, he said evenly. Ranger moved in front of Marisol without command. Not barking, not lunging, standing. Harlan's eyes flicked briefly to the dog, then back to her. I see you've made yourself comfortable, he said, surveying the broken building. It's my property, she replied. For now. The words were soft, almost casual. The wind moved across the lot, lifting grit along the ground. Harlan clasped his hands loosely in front of him. I'll be direct. The bypass project has been approved at the preliminary level. This parcel sits precisely where the primary access ramp must land. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the offer? I don't need to. He studied her for a moment, recalculating. I'm prepared to offer a generous settlement. Cash. Immediate transfer. Enough to secure comfortable housing elsewhere. Fresh start. The phrase landed with deliberate weight. Fresh start. She thought of the prison gate closing behind her, the $61 in her duffel bag, the boarded windows behind her now. I've already had my fresh start, she said quietly. Harlan's expression shifted, only slightly. You've also had complications, he replied. Parole conditions, residency restrictions. I'd hate for misunderstandings about occupancy violations to complicate your adjustment. Ranger's ears lifted at the subtle change in tone, once the message was clear. This wasn't generosity. It was pressure. Marisol held his gaze. You testified at my trial, she said. I testified to financial discrepancies, Harlan corrected smoothly. You testified to motive. He paused. I testified to facts as they were presented. Her jaw tightened. You were in my office before the fire, she continued, threatening my husband. I was negotiating a purchase. You said circumstances change. Harlan's face remained composed, but his eyes hardened slightly. Be careful, Ms. Vega. Accusations carry consequences. Ranger took one deliberate step forward, positioning himself directly between them. Harlan looked down at the dog, then back at her. Loyal, he observed. He knows when something's wrong. A thin smile touched Harlan's mouth. I'm not your enemy, he said. I'm offering resolution. No, she replied. You're offering silence. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Harlan reached into his coat pocket and removed a sealed envelope. He held it out, but did not step closer. This contains the formal offer, he said. It expires in 48 hours. Marisol didn't move to take it. Ranger's eyes never left Harlan's face. If you decline, Harlan continued, the county will proceed with enforcement, structural condemnation, eminent domain discussions. Legal costs can be exhausting. He let the word linger. Exhausting. She had survived 26 years of exhaustion. She wasn't afraid of that word anymore. I'm not leaving, she said. For the first time, the smooth polish slipped from his voice. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. You made it difficult 26 years ago. A beat of silence stretched between them. Harlan's gaze sharpened. I don't know what you think you found inside that building, he said carefully. But old recordings and conspiracy theories won't stand against documented evidence. The air seemed to still. Marisol didn't blink. I haven't mentioned recordings, she said. A flicker crossed his expression. Small, but real. Ranger's posture tightened further. Harlan recovered quickly. Speculation, he replied. People talk. Yes, she said evenly. They do. The two of them stood in the middle of the broken lot, the skeleton of the gas station behind her and the open road behind him. Finally, Harlan lowered the envelope slightly. 48 hours, he repeated. Yet he turned and walked back to the sedan. Before opening the door, he glanced once more at Ranger. Control your dog, he said quietly. He controls himself, Marisol answered. The engine started. The sedan backed out slowly, gravel crunching beneath its tires, and disappeared toward the highway. The lot fell silent again. Marisol stood where she was, her heart pounding but steady. Ranger relaxed only after the vehicle vanished from view. He turned toward her, searching her face. She exhaled slowly. He knows, she whispered. The tension that had built since the recording surfaced had reached a new level now. The threat was no longer indirect. It had stepped onto her property, spoken her name, and tried to buy her silence. She walked back into the service bay. The exposed section of wall remained open beneath the rotary phone. The recorder sat inside, its red light still blinking faintly. Blink, pause, blink. Not hidden anymore. Not forgotten. Marisol looked at the phone hanging crooked above the broken plaster. They're more than closure, she said softly. Ranger lay down beneath it once again, reclaiming his post. She understood now. The recordings weren't just proof of what happened before the fire. They were leverage. And for the first time in 26 years, she held something that made Gordon Harlan uneasy. Outside, the billboard near the highway gleamed under the afternoon sun. Building the future of Redwater. Inside the ruined station, the past was beginning to fight back. The article went live at 6:12 a.m. Marisol didn't see it first. Elena did, and her phone buzzed while she stood near the exposed wall, reviewing the recorder one more time before carefully packaging it for transfer to Elena's office. Check the Redwater Ledger online, Elena said over the phone. And the State Review-Journal. Caleb Turner published it. Published what? Marisol asked. Everything. The signal crackled faintly. Ranger lifted his head at the tone of urgency in Elena's voice. Caleb verified the audio. He tracked campaign donations tied to zoning approvals. He found 3 other property fires connected to parcels Harlan later acquired. Similar insurance irregularities. Similar audit timing. Marisol's grip tightened on the phone. "It's not just about you anymore," Elena continued. "It's about a pattern." Marisol ended the call and powered up the old borrowed phone she'd been using. The screen loaded slowly, the connection weak out here near the industrial edge. Then she saw it. Headline in bold: "Development giant linked to suspicious property fires. New audio surfaces." Below it, a photo of Vega fuel and service taken the day before. The boarded windows, the broken pumps. Ranger visible near the entrance, mid-step. Her breath caught. The article detailed Daniel's recorded statements. Harlan's voice captured discussing leverage, insurance audit acceleration, county board meetings that aligned too neatly with subsequent property transfers. Caleb Turner's byline carried weight. He had exposed corruption in neighboring counties before. The comments section was already filling. "How many more?" "I remember the mechanic shop fire on Route 9. Harlan always seemed too clean." Marisol lowered the phone slowly. The silence around the station felt different now. Not isolated. Charged. By mid-morning, vehicles began slowing as they passed. A news van parked briefly near the lot entrance before driving off again, likely checking coordinates. Ranger paced near the driveway, alert, but not agitated. He seemed to understand that something had shifted, though he couldn't see headlines or read comments. He only felt the change in her posture. She stood straighter now. Around noon, a pickup truck pulled into the lot and stopped abruptly. An older man stepped out, removing his cap. "Mrs. Vega?" he called cautiously. She recognized him after a moment. Luis Ortega, former mechanic who had rented a service bay from Daniel years ago. "You're still here," he said, scanning the station. "For now." He cleared his throat. "Oh, I read the article." He shifted his weight. "Back then, we all just believed what they told us. Electrical fire. Insurance mess. I didn't question it." She studied his face. "I should have," he added quietly. Ranger stood between them but didn't move forward. Luis glanced at the exposed section of wall through the open bay door. "Is it true?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "There was another fire," he said after a moment. 3 years after yours. Small warehouse off Maple Road. Owner wouldn't sell either. Went up in smoke, insurance paid. Harlan bought it 6 months later." Marisol absorbed the information carefully. "Would you be willing to say that on record?" she asked. Luis hesitated only a second. If they're listening now, they might as well hear the whole story by afternoon. The 2 more former business owners had contacted Elena's office. Similar stories. Similar pressure tactics. One mentioned aggressive insurance audits initiated by consultants linked to Harlan infrastructure. The pattern was tightening. Ranger returned to his post beneath the old rotary phone in the late afternoon light. The red indicator still blinked steadily. Marisol stood in the doorway, watching the sky shift toward gold. Her phone rang again. Elena's voice was calm but energized. "The County Ethics Board has opened a preliminary inquiry." "That fast?" "When public pressure hits the right temperature, institutions move." Marisol let out a slow breath. "This doesn't guarantee anything," Elena cautioned. "But it shifts leverage." As if summoned by the word, another vehicle rolled slowly onto the lot. Not a black sedan this time, as a news SUV. A young reporter stepped out with a cameraman, hesitating before approaching. "Mrs. Vega?" the reporter asked. "We're here about the recordings." Ranger positioned himself beside Marisol, steady and composed. She stepped forward. "You can film the building," she said. "You can film the wall. But the recordings go through my attorney." The reporter nodded quickly. "Of course." As the camera lens focused on the broken plaster beneath the rotary phone, Marisol felt the weight of years begin to lift. Not vanish, not dissolve, but shift from silent burden to visible truth. The town that had once turned away was watching again. Only this time, they weren't looking at her with suspicion. They were listening. By evening, the article had been picked up by regional outlets. The Harlan Infrastructure released a brief statement denying wrongdoing and calling the claims misleading and politically motivated. But the comments continued to grow. More names surfaced. More memories. Ranger rested beneath the phone, calm now, his earlier agitation replaced by quiet vigilance. Marisol crouched beside him and ran her hand along his back. "You started this," she murmured softly. He lifted his head, eyes steady. It had begun with a scratch against plaster, a sound too faint for her to hear. Now the sound had traveled far beyond the walls of Vega Fuel and Service. As dusk settled, headlights passed more slowly than before. Some drivers paused. Some took photos. The billboard down the highway still promised a shining future. But here, on cracked asphalt beneath a fading sign, another future was taking shape. One built not on silence, but on exposure. Inside the ruined station, the old rotary phone hung crooked and silent. Yet somehow, it had finally been heard. The notice arrived by certified mail 3 days later. Formal review hearing, State Capitol. Marisol read the heading twice before setting the envelope down on Daniel's old metal desk. Ranger watched her from beneath the exposed wall, ears tilted as if sensing the shift in her breathing. Elena had warned her it could move quickly once the ethics board flagged inconsistencies in the original investigation. Insurance documents had surfaced showing audit requests submitted through consultants linked to Harlan's firm. Financial transfers between subsidiaries had been flagged. Enough irregularities to justify reopening the case. But seeing the date in ink made it real. 2 weeks. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Redwater Flats was washed pale gray. A hired driver arranged by Elena arrived before sunrise. Marisol wore the only decent blouse she owned, pressed carefully the night before with a borrowed iron. Ranger sat at her feet as she laced her shoes. "You can't come inside," she told him quietly. His tail thumped once against the concrete floor. Elena met her on the courthouse steps in the state capitol. The building loomed wide and imposing, white stone reflecting the early light. Reporters clustered near the entrance, microphones already raised. When Marisol stepped out of the car, the flash of cameras startled her for a moment. Ranger, secured in the vehicle with a volunteer from a local shelter Elena had arranged, but barked once as if protesting the separation. Elena placed a steady hand on Marisol's arm. "Stay focused. Today is about the evidence." Inside, the courtroom air felt sterile and cold. Harlan sat at the opposing table, flanked by 2 attorneys in dark suits. He did not look at her when she entered. His expression remained professionally neutral, though his jaw appeared tighter than before. The panel overseeing the review consisted of 3 judges and a state prosecutor assigned to examine potential misconduct in the original investigation. Elena began calmly. She outlined the timeline: property acquisition attempts, accelerated insurance audits, Daniel's recorded statements warning of coercion, and the pattern of fires connected to parcels Harlan later acquired. When the recorder was placed on the evidence table, the room grew still. Marisol's hands folded tightly in her lap. The first audio file played. Daniel's voice filled the courtroom, thinner than it had sounded in the service bay, but unmistakable. "If this place burns, it won't be an accident." A murmur rippled faintly through the gallery. Harlan's attorney objected, citing chain of custody concerns. Elena countered with expert verification of the device's age, wiring integration, and authenticity. A forensic audio analyst testified to the recording's consistency with time-stamped components manufactured before the fire. Then came the second recording, Harlan's voice. "You don't need to sell. Circumstances change." The words echoed differently here than they had in the abandoned station. In this room, they felt heavier. The prosecutor presented financial records showing that Harlan Infrastructure subsidiaries had received advance notification of zoning shifts tied to the bypass project, years before public disclosure. Insurance audit consultants were traced to affiliated firms. The original fire report was dissected. An independent electrical engineer testified that the breaker box damage was inconsistent with accidental malfunction patterns. Marisol sat motionless. Every word peeled back layers of the story she had lived with for 26 years. When she was called to speak, her voice trembled at first, but steadied quickly. "I never set that fire," she said. "I lost my husband in it. I lost my freedom after it. I lost everything tied to this place." She glanced briefly at Harlan. "And I was told it was my fault." Harlan's attorney rose for cross-examination. attempting to frame the recordings as incomplete, contextually ambiguous. But the weight of corroborating documents pressed against that narrative. Former property owners testified remotely, recounting similar pressures. Luis Ortega's voice crackled over the speaker system as he described the Maple Road warehouse fire and subsequent acquisition. By late afternoon, the judges recessed for deliberation. Marisol stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, the marble floor cool beneath her feet. Elena paced quietly beside her. "You did well," Elena said. Marisol nodded faintly. Across the hall, Harlan stood with his attorneys. He no longer appeared composed. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt despite the cool air. After 45 minutes, the courtroom doors reopened. The panel returned. The presiding judge adjusted his glasses and began reading. In light of newly presented evidence, including recorded statements, financial documentation, and procedural inconsistencies, this panel finds substantial grounds to vacate the original conviction of Marisol Vega. The words seemed to hover in the air. Vacate. Further investigation into potential misconduct and fraud is hereby referred to the state attorney's office. A sound escaped Marisol's throat, half breath, half disbelief. Elena squeezed her hand. Reporters surged forward as soon as the session adjourned. Flashbulbs popped, microphones extended toward her face. "How does it feel?" someone asked. She searched for language but found only silence. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. As Ranger barked sharply from the vehicle when he saw her emerge. The volunteer holding his leash smiled and stepped aside as the dog pulled forward. Ranger reached her in 3 strides, pressing his head against her chest with sudden force. She wrapped her arms around his neck. For a moment, the noise of reporters and cameras faded into the background. Across the plaza, Gordon Harlan exited through a side door. His face remained tight as he moved quickly toward a waiting car. By evening, news channels carried the update statewide. Wrongful conviction overturned in Redwater fire case developer under investigation. Back at the station that night, the air felt different. The unsafe structure notice still hung on the window. The roof still sagged. The gas pumps remained stripped bare, but the weight pressing against her chest had shifted. Marisol stood beneath the old rotary phone and looked at the exposed wall. The red indicator on the recorder blinked steadily. Blink. Pause. Blink. The truth had traveled from behind plaster to a courtroom in the Capitol. Ranger lay down, beneath the phone once again, calmer than he had been in days. Marisol lowered herself onto the office chair and let the silence settle. Vindication did not erase 26 years. It did not bring Daniel back. It did not rebuild what had been burned. But it changed the record. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the highway bend. The billboard still promised a future engineered by Harlan Infrastructure. But the future now looked uncertain. And for the first time since the fire, uncertainty no longer belonged to her alone. No, the news cycle moved faster than Marisol could process. By the end of the week, Gordon Harlan had announced a temporary leave of absence from his role as CEO of Harlan Infrastructure. The company issued another carefully worded statement, cooperating fully, committed to transparency, confident in our practices. The stock price dipped. Developers paused negotiations on the bypass extension. The billboard near the highway was removed overnight. In its place, only 2 metal poles remained, cutting dark lines against the sky. Marisol stood in the lot that morning with Ranger at her side, staring at the empty space where the sign had once promised a shining future. "Guess they're rethinking that slogan," she murmured. Ranger flicked his ears at the wind and nudged her knee gently. But the compensation hearings followed quickly after the conviction was vacated. The state issued a formal apology, brief, procedural, but recorded. A settlement was negotiated for wrongful imprisonment. The amount, when Elena called to confirm it, left Marisol silent for several seconds. "It won't restore what was lost," Elena said carefully, "but it gives you options." Options. The word felt unfamiliar in her mouth. A week later, she stood inside the service bay with a clipboard in hand, studying the cracked concrete floor and sagging beams as a structural engineer hired through Elena's referral examined the building. "It's salvageable," he said, tapping the metal support columns. "The fire damage was mostly contained to the rear storage area. Roof will need reinforcement. Wiring's shot. Plumbing too. But the frame's solid. Marisol looked around the space. Dust still clung to every surface. The old desk remained dented. The exposed wall beneath the rotary phone had been carefully cleaned, but left open. She could sell. Developers had already begun circling again, quieter this time. Offers arrived through intermediaries, generous ones. With the settlement and the land value rising after the bypass rerouting discussion stalled, she could walk away comfortably. Start somewhere else. No broken walls, no ghosts. But each time she stepped outside and looked at the empty lot, she saw something different now. Not the night of the fire, not the courtroom. She saw Luis standing uncertainly at the edge of the gravel. She saw the news van parked near the entrance. She saw Ranger beneath the old phone, was refusing to ignore a sound she couldn't hear. The phone buzzed in her hand one afternoon as she sorted through old paperwork. It was Elena. "Harlan resigned," she said. "Officially. Charges pending. Fraud, obstruction, possible conspiracy. The investigation's widening." Marisol closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you," she said. "You did the hard part," Elena replied. "You listened." That evening, she sat on an overturned crate in the service bay while Ranger lay at her feet. "I could sell," she said aloud. Ranger lifted his head. "Buy a small house near the coast. Quiet. No reminders." He blinked slowly, watching her face. But then what? The question lingered. 26 years had been taken from her. Years she could never reclaim. She had entered prison at 41. She left at 67. Yet rebuilding a life from scratch felt overwhelming. But standing still felt worse. 2 days later, she drove into town and stopped outside a modest brick building near the rail yard. Redwater Community Reintegration Center. The director, a middle-aged woman named Tara Kim, met her inside. "We mostly focus on job placement for people coming out of incarceration," Tara explained. "Manufacturing, warehouse work, entry-level positions." "What about mechanical training?" Marisol asked. Tara tilted her head. "Limited programs. Funding's tight." Marisol glanced at the framed certificates on the wall, stories of men and women who had passed through the program, seeking second chances. "I own a property," she said slowly. "Industrial zoning. Large service bay. It needs work." Tara studied her carefully. "Oh, you're thinking about turning it into something." Marisol nodded. "A vocational repair workshop," she said. "Auto basics, small engine work, practical skills. Nothing fancy. Just something real." Tara's expression shifted from polite curiosity to interest. "Why?" Marisol thought of the courtroom, the tapes, the years inside, the way Ranger had refused to ignore a sound others dismissed. "Because people need somewhere to start," she said simply. Renovations began within a month. Contractors reinforced beams and replaced wiring. Fresh concrete was poured where cracks ran deepest. The gas pumps were removed entirely, leaving open space at the front of the lot. Marisol insisted on one thing. The wall beneath the rotary phone would remain open. The metal panel would stay visible. The phone itself, dust cleaned, its cord hanging, would not be replaced. "Are you sure?" the contractor asked. "Most folks would patch that up." "No," she said quietly. "That stays." Ranger supervised every stage of the renovation, pacing between workers, occasionally settling beneath the old phone as if guarding a monument. When the first shipment of refurbished tool cabinets arrived, Marisol stood in the center of the bay and let the noise of progress fill the space. Hammering, drilling, voices discussing measurements. It was loud, messy, alive. The unsafe structure notice had long since been removed. In its place, a temporary banner hung above the entrance. Vega Repair and Training. Below it, in smaller letters, "Second chances start here." On the evening before the official opening, Marisol walked through the nearly finished space alone. But workbenches lined the walls. A chalkboard stood near the entrance listing class times. A small office corner had been restored, Daniel's desk refinished and polished. Ranger lay beneath the rotary phone, calm as ever. She paused beside him. "We could have left," she said softly. He lifted his head and rested his chin against her hand. Outside, headlights moved steadily along the highway bend. Inside, the station hummed with quiet readiness. The verdict had cleared her name. But this was something more deliberate. Not revenge, not escape, renewal. The first morning of classes began before sunrise. Marisol unlocked the front door of the renovated station, while the air still carried the cool edge of night. The gravel lot had been leveled and compacted. Fresh paint framed the windows. The old Vega sign had been restored. Oh, not flashy, but steady and clean. Ranger stepped inside ahead of her, nails clicking softly against the new concrete overlay. The service bay no longer echoed the way it once had. Workbenches lined the perimeter. Tool chests gleamed under overhead lights. A row of donated engines sat on pallets near the rear wall, tagged and ready for training exercises. But one section remained untouched. Beneath the old rotary phone, the plaster was still broken away. The metal panel remained visible. The recorder, now deactivated and preserved, sat secured behind a clear protective cover. A small placard rested beside it. April 14th. Evidence that changed everything. Marisol ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the mounted frame. The contractor had offered to conceal it. She had refused. Some things were not meant to disappear again. Thus, by 8 o'clock, the first trainees arrived. 6 of them. 3 men in their 20s, 1 in his 50s, a young woman with a shaved head and guarded posture, and a quiet middle-aged father recently released after serving time for a non-violent offense. They stood awkwardly near the entrance at first, unsure whether to step fully inside. Marisol wiped her hands on a rag and walked toward them. "Welcome," she said simply. "No speeches, no dramatic introduction. Just welcome." Ranger moved slowly between them, sniffing each person with measured curiosity, before settling near the front desk. The shaved-head woman glanced at the exposed wall. "What happened there?" she asked. Marisol paused. "History," she replied. Classes began with basics. How to identify engine components, how to handle tools safely, and how to listen to mechanical sounds before reaching for a wrench. Listening first. The phrase carried deeper meaning for her now. By mid-morning, the space filled with the rhythm of work, metal clinking, engines coughing to life under careful adjustment, low conversations between trainees helping one another troubleshoot small mistakes. Luis Ortega stopped by around noon with a box of donated carburetors. "Figured you could use these," he said. She smiled. "I can." More locals began drifting in over the next few days. Some brought parts, others brought coffee. A few simply stood at the doorway, watching the transformation of a place they had once avoided. The old accusations had faded into something quieter. Respect, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. Each afternoon, Ranger returned to his usual position beneath the rotary phone. As he lay there without agitation now. No scratching, no barking, just presence. Sometimes trainees would sit nearby during breaks, leaning against the wall beneath the preserved recorder. One afternoon, the quiet middle-aged father, Thomas, remained seated there longer than the others. He stared at the metal panel for a long time. "That recording," he said eventually. "It proved what they said wasn't true." "Yes," Thomas nodded slowly. "They said things about me too," he added. "Things that stuck." Marisol sat down beside him. "It takes time," she said, "but truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored." He looked at her, considering that. Across the bay, a small engine roared to life successfully for the first time under one of the younger trainees' hands. Laughter broke out. The sound echoed through the building, not hollow anymore, but full. Late that evening, after the trainees had left and the tools were put away, Marisol walked the length of the service bay alone. The lights hummed softly overhead. Fresh paint still carried a faint scent. She paused beneath the rotary phone. The cord hung exactly as it had for decades, coiled and disconnected. Ranger patted over and lay down beneath it, chin resting on his paws. "You still guarding it?" she asked gently. He blinked at her. She understood now that he hadn't been guarding the phone itself. He had been guarding the truth behind it. The wall remained open, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what had been hidden, of what had been uncovered, of what listening could change. Outside, the highway moved steadily in the dark. No billboard loomed above it now. The lot lights cast a soft glow over the gravel, illuminating the restored sign at the entrance. Vega Repair and Training. Marisol turned off the overhead lights one by one until only the small lamp in the office remained. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt lived in, used, needed. Ranger rose and followed her toward the office corner. Before settling for the night, he walked back once more to the exposed wall, circled beneath the phone, and lay down exactly where he had the first night she freed him from the fence post. She watched him for a moment. Some things had changed completely. Some things had stayed exactly the same. And in that quiet balance, the station no longer felt like a relic of what had been lost. It felt like proof of what had been rebuilt. Months passed, yet the rhythm of the workshop settled into something steady and dependable. Mornings began with the grind of the bay doors lifting and the low hum of coffee brewing in the office. By mid-morning, engines were spread open across benches, hands darkened with grease, conversations moving easily between instruction and laughter. Redwater Flats no longer spoke her name in whispers. They spoke it in reference. Call Vega's place. They'll fix it. They'll show you how. On a quiet Thursday evening, after the last trainee left and the tools were returned to their drawers, Marisol remained behind. The sun dipped low beyond the warehouses, casting long amber light across the gravel lot. The highway murmured in the distance, steady and unremarkable. Inside, the workshop was calm. Workbenches stood clean. A chalk dust clung faintly to the board near the entrance where she had written next week's schedule. A small fan rotated slowly in the corner. Ranger lay beneath the old rotary phone, as he always did at closing. The wall remained open. The recorder, sealed behind its protective casing, reflected a faint glow from the overhead lights. Marisol walked slowly across the service bay, her steps unhurried. She paused near the entrance, listening to the quiet. There had been a time when silence felt heavy, like something pressing down on her chest. Now it felt different, full. She crossed back toward the exposed wall and crouched beside Ranger. "You remember that first night?" she asked softly. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice. "You wouldn't move," she continued. "Oh, you just kept staring at this thing." She glanced up at the rotary phone. It still hung crooked, its cord disconnected, its surface polished only enough to remove dust, but not age. The first time she had pressed the receiver to her ear, she'd heard nothing. The first time Ranger scratched at the plaster, she'd nearly told him to stop. If she had. If she'd ignored him. If she'd decided it was just a dog chasing shadows. She reached up and gently touched the edge of the broken wall. The air inside the station hummed faintly from the electrical lines installed during renovation. Outside, a car passed along the highway, tires whispering against pavement. Ranger shifted and rested his chin against her knee. "I thought justice would feel louder," she said quietly. "Bigger." She had imagined fireworks of relief, a sudden erasure of the past. Applause. Something cinematic. Instead, it had come through static, through a red light blinking behind plaster, through the scratch of claws on a wall she almost ignored, through a voice preserved on tape saying, "If this place burns, it won't be an accident." Justice had arrived without spectacle. It had arrived through attention. Marisol rose slowly and walked toward the bay doors. She flipped off half the overhead lights, leaving only a soft glow near the office and the exposed wall. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor. The station breathed quietly around her. Earlier that day, one of the younger trainees had secured a job at a local repair shop. Another had asked about staying on as an assistant instructor. Thomas had brought his daughter by to show her where he worked now. The girl had run her fingers along the polished tool cabinet, eyes wide with something close to pride. Marisol had stood back and watched, not as someone defined by what had been taken from her, but as someone defined by what she chose to build. She returned to the exposed wall one last time before locking up. The recorder was silent now, its red light long extinguished after the evidence had been archived and preserved. The rotary phone would never ring again. It didn't need to. Ranger stood and stretched, then turned in a slow circle before settling back into his familiar place beneath the phone. He no longer scratched. He no longer barked. He simply lay there, steady and calm. Marisol leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Oh, she understood something now that she hadn't understood when she stepped off that bus with $61 and nowhere to go. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it begins with something smaller. A restless dog, a hollow sound in a wall, a detail that doesn't fit, and the decision to look closer. She opened her eyes and looked around the service bay one more time. The tools, the benches, the open wall, the dog beneath the phone, the building that once burned, the building that now hummed with life. She switched off the final light.
In the dim glow of block lamps outside, Vega repair and training stood solid against the night. Inside, beneath the silent rotary phone, Ranger lifted his head briefly, listening not for hidden machine or buried recording, but for the steady quiet of a place at peace. Marisol locked the door and stepped into the evening air. The highway carried its ordinary sound. The future dressed forward, not uncertain now, but open, and she walked toward it without looking back. Sometimes the biggest turning points don't arrive with noise. They begin with something small we almost ignore. Marisol didn't get her year back, but she reclaimed her name, her place, and the courage to look behind the wall when everyone else had walked away. If you were in her place, would you have shown the plan and left, or stayed to rebuild something from that asset? Tell me which choice you would make, and if this story stays with you, I'd be honored if you follow along for more journey like this.